Hello, my friends. I have a magic sword and I can do many cool things. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. Yager. I flinched from my daydream, knocking a neat stack of papers from my desk to the floor, which, along with my most certainly ridiculous appearance at the moment, earned me a salve of laughter from my co-workers. Fixing my glasses, I hastily lifted my sight, only to be greeted by the strict and spiteful eyes of my boss. "Oh, hello, Miss Beeler," I half shouted, half whimpered, attempting in vain to look dignified. "That's Miss Harker for you, Yager." She spoke in her usual slave master tone. "And just what were you doing dozing off there? I'm not paying you to sleep, I'm paying you to work. If you can call that pay," I muttered in my chin. "What was that?" Her expression was now sterner than ever. "Nothing," I screeched with a forced smile. I was aware of the growing laughter of my colleagues. Her eyes narrowed to the point she almost looked like a vampire. Felt like one as well. Working for her was described as blood-sucking by almost all of her employees. Whenever she would walk into a room, I felt loose, and it would feel like the temperature shifted by a fraction of a degree. Listen and listen well, Yager. You only got this far because Jeleniak put in a good word for you. And I expect you to justify his words. Or else, well, you'll only be useful as spare blood. Useful as spare blood. Her way of saying that I'll be fired, and one that was heard all too often. I believe I speak for all when I say we hated that catchphrase of hers. My most sincere apologies, Miss Harker. I'll get back to work straight away, I managed to speak through a fake grin. Very well. Carry on. She turned to face my co-workers. "And what are the lot of you doing, snickering like a pack of hyenas?" she yelled. "Back to work." All of my co-workers swiftly turned to their computers, not eager to hear another round of scolding, but still shaking of muffled laughter. Thankfully, my shift was over in just an hour, so I was able to leave that hellhole quickly. Not quickly enough for my taste, though. Oh dear. I forgot to introduce myself, didn't I? Forgive my manners. Or the lack of them? My name is Michael Yager, although most people call me Michael, I guess it's easier to pronounce. I was born in FR Yugoslavia as Michael Vukovic, in 1992. Faced with a poor economical state in the country, my parents emigrated to Germany the same year. My mother's grandparents, who escaped to Germany during World War II under false names, as a couple barely out of their teens, took us in until we could stand on our own feet. For the sake of simplicity, and to avoid some potentially nasty problems with the authorities, we renounced our original surname, and took on the surname that our grandparents coined for themselves, Yager. When I was younger, I often asked my grandfather why did he choose that surname. His only response ever was, "It is linked to the ancient history of our family, Mihi. Pray that you never find out." My grandparents passed away in 2003, both at the healthy age of 80 and only hours apart. When I turned 18, back in 2010, I moved out of my parents' house after saving enough money from part-times to rent a small apartment. It was actually only one sparsely furnished room that served as a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room, with a small bathroom, but I didn't complain. I liked it that way. After a few failed attempts at finding a real job, I finally found one a few months ago, Dual Arc Incorporated, a small programming corporation, that would be absolutely perfect if not for that Nosferatu of a woman that was our boss. The salary was sad, but at least I wasn't starving. But back to the present. As I walked through dark, misty streets of Gruslig, I hummed a melody of Marseillais to myself. Ever since I learned it from Lorraine Morenas, my current girlfriend, I always thought it was catchy, and I loved humming it as a way to calm myself. I got to my apartment in about half an hour. Home sweet home, I proclaimed to myself out loud, tossing my dewy jacket aside, and setting a kettle on the stove. It was only then that I noticed a deviation on my lavender floor tiles. A large paper envelope. I had mail. Strange, my parents and I only ever communicated with Skype. They thought it was a marvel of modern science, and I didn't have any friends in foreign countries. And yet there it was, a single envelope of orange paper signed to my address. There was no sender address. Curious, I opened it up. Inside, there was a much smaller envelope of thick paper, yellowed with age, signed with elegant, curly letters that read: For instructions of our client, Hansel Jaeger, formerly known as Jovan Vukovic, this letter is to be delivered to him on August 19, 2007, to his current address. In case of passing of our client, the letter is to be delivered to his oldest male descendant a day before his 20th birthday. I inspected the rear side of the letter. The sending date was 1941. He sent this letter over 70 years ago. But why? Why send a letter to himself? Unless he wanted to keep something of value to himself from being lost and forgotten. But why so far in the future? And holy crabs, tomorrow is my 20th birthday? That's right, May 2nd. How could I have forgotten about it? Jobs can really kill a man's spirit, huh? I opened the letter. Inside there was a tiny fur bag with something hard inside. I untied the bag and turned it over my palm. A gleaming ring fell into my hand. I was bewildered, to say at the very least. I dropped the bag and brought the ring closer to my face to inspect it. It was made out of two metal bands, one black and one white, interwoven in an intricate pattern, and covered across the middle with another, thinner band, obviously made out of silver. The silver band was inscribed with a script that I recognized from one of my father's history books, Glagolitic. Even though my mother insisted I learned our ancestral language, I never bothered to learn Glagolitic, and I could only guess what the inscription meant. But that was now the least of my concerns. Why would I be worried about it? After all, the ring was so beautiful, so unique, so perfect. I was just about to slip it on, when a loud whistle snapped me from my stupor. I turned around faster than a fox, my wild imagination already conjuring flying monstrosities and carnivorous tank engines, and came face to face with a steaming kettle. Cursing, I dropped the ring and rushed to get the kettle. Of course, most of the water had been vaporized, but I still had enough for a small cup. As I enjoyed my tea, my gaze wandered to the ring on the floor. I remembered my drunken fascination with it, and all of a sudden, it no longer seemed so perfect. Nevertheless, after I finished my tea, I picked it up from the floor. It was now pleasantly warm to the touch for some reason and stuffed it back into the fur bag. I stashed the bag back in the envelope, and it was then that I noticed 4 words neatly written on the inside of it, in neat, narrow handwriting of my grandfather. Get rid of it. What the hell? Why send me the ring if I was just to destroy it? Do I look like Frodo Baggins? Then again, my grandfather was not a fool, and he certainly knew what he was doing. Pushing those almost disturbing thoughts aside, I took a shower and went to sleep. I was awakened next morning by soothing tones of Stairway to Heaven screaming in my ear. I turned the alarm off, as much as Plant's vocals were a balm to the soul. I needed some sleep. After what seemed like a minute, I got up, and as soon as I looked on my phone, I was washed over in a chilling panic. It was 8:15. Bloody hell, I was working the morning shift today. I was late. I decided that a shower and a breakfast could wait, got dressed much quicker than I was used to, and rushed to my workplace. I was there in 15 minutes, a record, to be certain, but it was not enough. As I rushed by the clerk in an empty lobby, he gestured me to stop. "Wait, Yager," he shouted. I stopped as if frozen solid. I turned to him and had a sight to see, a small cardboard box labeled with my name. "Mr. Yager," he started, sounding weary, "Miss Harker wanted me to give you this box." He paused for breath and continued. "She also said that you've been demoted to spare blood." "I'm sorry." The expression on his face told me that he indeed was sorry. I thanked the old man, took the box and went home. Fired. On my birthday even. That definitely sounds like me. Well, no use in wallowing in my own misery, time to go looking for another job. At least I had a date with Lorraine to look forward to. I went home, had a breakfast and a shower, changed into less formal attire and waited. At 1600 hours, I decided to surprise Lorraine by showing up an hour early. I was usually always the one late. I went to our designated meeting place, Jade Meyer Onions, a small but good restaurant near the outskirts of the city. I could never get over the fact that it was named as it was. But the food was good. The atmosphere was homely, and the prices were fair, so I couldn't really complain. I walked inside and took a seat at the bar. I was almost immediately approached by the owner and a bartender, an aging man with a long hair, a bald patch above his forehead, and a perpetual smile on his face, all of which made him look like a retired rock star. "Excuse me, boss," I asked, used to address him like that. "Did you see a girl in a rainbow shirt pass through here today?" I did, lad," he answered in his deep baritone voice. "The pretty brown one with green eyes, no?" "Yes, that one," I answered. The bartender grunted. "Sorry, lad, you just missed her. Went behind with some tall red-haired one," he said, and I could see the color drain from his face when he realized the weight of his words. I rushed behind, near the rhododendron bushes that served as a great cover. And I had a sight to see. Lorraine was there, naked, leaning against the wall, hugging my best friend and co-worker Dave Jeleniak with both her legs and her arms. They were both covered in sweat and moaning, as Dave repeatedly thrusted into her. I watched, transfixed and stunned at the same time, unable to stop them, or even say anything, every moan and gasp cutting into my soul like the sharpest sword in the world. They kissed, and I felt a bizarre mixture of anger and melancholy bloom in my chest. They broke the kiss, and Dave spoke. "Hey, weren't you supposed to meet that Michael character here today?" Lorraine's expression changed to an irritated one. "I did," she said. "And what of it?" "I thought he was your boyfriend," Dave muttered. "Ha! You disable Louie," she laughed, and even though I did not understand her, I felt a part of me die off. I silently retreated back inside the restaurant and took my place at the bar. The bartender said nothing, and instead poured me a glass of Jägermeister. I drained the glass and slammed it back on the bar. He refilled it, and I looked up to his face with my tearful eyes. "On the house, lad," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. 5 hours and as many Jägermeisters later, I was staggering down the main street. The bartender was never cheap with the size of his drinks, and now I paid the price for that. After struggling for about 20 minutes to unlock the door, and overhearing a middle-aged scold some skinny, black-haired drunkard, I got into my apartment and dropped on the floor. It was like the force of the impact cleared my mind, and in a moment, tears started flowing like the waters of Danube. Damn that witch, Harker. Damn that harlot, Lorraine. Damn that backstabbing rat, David. A message arrived on my phone. It was Lorraine. "Why didn't you show up today, dear?" That was it. That was the last straw. That whore was acting as if I was the guilty party here. I threw my phone at the wall, screaming like a lost soul and no doubt waking up a few of my neighbors. I heard a dull thump when a phone hit the wall, and another, sharper sound of a metallic object falling on the floor. It was the ring. How did it get out of the bag? How did it even get out of the envelope? How did it fall? Doesn't matter. It seems that my late grandfather was the only one not to bury me on my own birthday. Well, he and the bartender. To hell with it all, I decided. I might as well wear the damned thing. I picked up a ring and slid it on my right index finger. My entire body was immediately overrun by a tide of cramps that ended as soon as they came, giving way to total numbness. The air around me felt like a miasma. I blacked out as I fell on the floor yet again. I woke up in the dead of night. I felt like I'd been constricted by the world's largest snake covered in quills, and the world around me was fractured and blurry. Must have dropped my glasses, I thought to myself. But they were still on my face. I took them off and to my great surprise, realized that I beheld the room around me clearer than ever. I looked back to my glasses, cracked and bent like a piece of abstract art, looking so tiny and useless between my blue fingers. Wait, blue fingers? I shook my head. My hands were blue, and at the tip of each finger, a vicious black claw stood in a place of a nail. Must be my mind playing tricks on me. The room is dark, also. But I could see everything else like I was in dim light, and not pitch black. It made no sense for my hands to be an exception. I found the light switch and flicked it on, immediately blinded by intense white light. I raised my hands to protect my eyes. Unmistakably, they were dark blue, covered in sparse black hair, and strangely muscular. My eyes fell to my bare torso. It was hairless, dark blue, and bulky like I was an experienced lumberjack. I didn't even remember taking off my shirt. I searched for it with my eyes. It was near the place I fell, shredded in ribbons. Things were really starting to get freaky now. I decided to get to the bottom of this and flung open my wardrobe, looking at myself in the mirror built inside the inner side of the doors. As soon as my eyes fell on my reflection, I yelled in shock and surprise, and a guttural growl escaped my throat. My skin was completely dark blue, covered with patches of dense black hair on my upper back and shoulders, but otherwise almost completely hairless. I was more muscular than ever. My once short black hair now fell past my shoulders, like a mane, hiding my almost elven ears covered in grey fur. But the most dreadful parts were my mouth and eyes. My lips were only a bit darker than the rest of my skin and could barely conceal long, canine fangs that stood out among numerous other sharp, pointy teeth in my jaw. And my eyes. My once brilliantly blue eyes were now a dark shade of what they used to be, with black sclera, and indigo irids. My pupils were tall and narrow, the eyes of a predator. After I overcame the initial shock, I looked at my right hand. The ring was still there. I removed it and felt a wave of heat run through my blood. Before my eyes, my skin paled, my body hair and ears contracted, and I reverted back to my old self. My eyes were still a bit darker than usual, but no longer in need of glasses. I put the ring back on, and with another wave of heat, I was the beast once again. Strangely enough, I felt good. With all the misfortune I had today, I should have felt like a garbage dump. Instead, I felt alive. More alive than ever. I sniffed the air, and it was full of scents I never felt so strongly before. I looked out of the window, just in time to see a pair of schoolgirls, no older than 15, walking down the street. I could tell the warmest parts of their bodies with but a glance. Their hearts, their necks, their lower abdomens. Despite a double-panel window and about 12 meters of distance between us, I could hear them laughing, chatting about some boys from their class that they fancied. Their voices made me feel strange. I felt the need to go out and confront them, grab them, drive them to the ground, bite them, rip them. I turned my head, feeling the hunger go away. But it never truly left. It was still there, growling, demanding to be fed. And I would feed it. I looked once again at my hand, clenching it. Such power should not go to waste. I knew what I would do next. David lived about halfway between my apartment and Dual Luck, in a house that his parents left him. He was unpleasantly surprised to see me at the small hours, but I let myself in. "What the hell, man?" he exclaimed as I pushed by him inside of his house. "Problem, mate?" I sounded jovial. "Not going to refuse a surprise visit from your bro, eh?" He was confused. "No, but..." "Splendid!" I cried vehemently. "Let me pour us some drinks, shall I?" I pulled out a bottle of scotch from his kitchen and poured us both a glass. I drained mine, before offering his to him. He accepted it but was now frowning. "Look, man," he began, "we're brothers, but you can't just stroll into my house at night and drink my scotch like it's nothing." I felt the explosion of anger inside of me, but I repressed it. "Not yet. I take that this means you have trouble with me taking your things without question, eh?" "Yes," he yelled. I dropped my empty glass, and before it hit the ground, grabbed David by his face and pinned him to the wall. In one swift movement, I pulled the ring out of my pocket and slid it onto my finger. Dave screamed of terror as he witnessed my transformation was muffled by my growing hand. I snarled soothingly as if to say SHH, no more tears, but he only kept screaming. I decided I've had enough of it. I opened my jaws wide and went for the throat. Lorraine was striding near Strams Park, towards David's house. I messaged her from his phone, inviting her for round 2. Now that I saw the eager look on her face when I stalked her from buildings, it almost made me sick. Almost. I started humming Marseille's best that I could with my bestial voice. It was deep but spread out, like every particle of the air was humming itself. She must have heard it, because she started looking around herself, now looking less eager and more frightened. Good. I leapt from the building and landed near Lorraine with a soft, inaudible thud. I took off my ring, and called to her. "Lorraine," I cried. She turned around and gasped. "Mon Dieu, Michael. What are you doing here?" "Just taking a walk." "At this time of night?" "And what of you, my dear?" She didn't answer. "Lorraine, it just occurred to me, you are from Lozère, are you not?" "Yes," she answered, confused. "If I remember correctly, that region was once called Gévaudan." She nodded. "Do you fear the beast?" I asked, grinning maliciously. "I do not," she proudly exclaimed, with a smug smile on her face. "You should. my dear," I responded in French, the language I didn't even know I knew. I watched her smile fade. "How do you?" She started in the same language. I unzipped my bag and threw her the item I held inside. She caught it, confused, and then let out the most blood-curdling scream. David's severed head grinned at her from her hands. She dropped it and backed away, before lifting her sight to where I stood. But the only thing to meet her eyes was incarnate of the beast of Jevorton. Before she could run, I was upon her. I grabbed her and dragged her off into the park. It was thick with furs. No one would see us, or hear her screams. Bela Harker was awakened by a loud, hasty knocking on the doors of her house. She opened them, only to see me, smiling widely at her. "Good God, Yeager, what is it now?" she yelled in her slave master voice. "Good evening, Miss Harker," I said with my eager voice. "What are you doing here? I'm not employing you again. I didn't come to ask for my job back. I simply wanted to say hi to you, Miss Mina. Listen here, you." She stopped mid-word, shocked upon realizing of what I just called her. Her pupils narrowed, looking almost feline now and then widened again as I pierced her chest with my left hand. I slid my ring in a split second that it took her to register my words, and now I took a firm hold of her warm heart, yanked it out, causing a torrent of blood to splash me from head to heel, and dropped it before her feet. She gave me one last surprised look, before crumbling to dust, unleashing hideous stench. "Well, who have thunk?" I said to myself, wiping my bloody hand on her ash-covered nightgown. Police interrogated me concerning the deaths of 3 people, all linked to me. I feigned fear and shock, ranting about how I was next. They dropped the matter soon enough, probably thought I was a loony. 2 months later, I moved to Schwarzwald and got a job in a local store. I kept the ring, and I still slip it on from time to time. For the villages of Schwarzwald are nothing short of a den of iniquity, filled with a game that suits me, so much deceit, so much treason, so many lies. And there is only one hunter to claim it all. Hello, friends. This werewolf is not alive. Oh no. He is alive. His fingers are moving. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. Gerald Bishop was the doctor you called when you needed immediate medical attention but didn't want to go to the hospital. It's not that Gerald had failed out of medical school, or had botched up surgery or something like that. Gerald was quite a capable and sober doctor. It's just that, years ago, he had met somebody who presented an opportunity to him, and the money was quite good. He could make more in 3 nights than he could an entire year if he'd kept his old job at the hospital. I was Gerald's assistant. If the phone rang, it meant that somebody with a lot of money was in trouble. We had a few different houses that we preferred to work out of, but we were also willing to travel. There was a decommissioned ambulance for local trips and Gerald's airplane for long-distance trips. All travel expenses, naturally, were reimbursed. We didn't discriminate. If somebody came in with a gunshot wound, we didn't ask where it came from, except to get a clearer picture of how best to treat it. If a celebrity came in with something jammed up his rectum, and that happened more than once, we got it unstuck and sent him on his way. We were on call 24/7, though mostly we worked in the dead of night, and there were only 12 nights out of the 365 where we weren't on call. Any other night was fair game. It didn't matter if it were Christmas, or if Gerald were in Europe on vacation with his family. Sometimes, I'd have to treat the clients myself while he walked me through it over video chat, but we always answered the call. Except for those 12 nights. Those nights were the full moons, and we couldn't answer any calls because I was watching over Gerald and his wife in their basement, where they were bound in silver chains because they were werewolves. They could control their urges most any other time, except when the moon was full. Then they would send their 2 kids to a sitter and call me over. I'd come over with the gun with silver bullets in it they had given me. If one of us gets out, shoot us, Gerald told me on that first horrifying night. If you can, shoot to wound. If you can't, shoot to kill. It's okay, William. It's the agreement that Mary and I came to. Then I'd chain them up. The transformation was hideous. Bones shifted under the flesh as the bishops writhed around in seemingly unbearable pain. It was as though an invisible force were pulling their faces away, contorting the nose and mouth into a snout. I watched their teeth clatter to the floor as sharp fangs poked their way through bloody gums. Hair sprouted all over as body parts stretched and pulled in a ballet of horror. Instinctively, I pulled the trigger of the gun the first time I witnessed it. The safety catch was engaged, so no bullets came forth. The transformation took less than a minute but would haunt my nightmares for months, as would the rest of that night. Eventually, as with most horrors, I would grow used to it. But not for a long time. I sat in a chair in the opposite corner of the basement, near the stairs, and watched the bishops all night, as they raged against their chains, howling in pain each time the silver dug in. I prayed the whole time that the chains wouldn't break loose. If they did, I knew that I would likely be dead, silver bullet or not. The night seemed endless, but at long last it did end. As the first hints of dawn crept in through the daylight windows, the beasts bent down, scooped up their human teeth, and swallowed them. As their bodies underwent another painful transformation, they slumped to the ground and lost consciousness. It was the night of a full moon when our business line rang and I declined to answer it. It was the first time that anybody had actually tried to call it during a full moon, as we spread the news of our night off throughout our networks of clientele well in advance each month. The phone kept ringing. I pulled it out of my pocket and looked at it quickly, as the 2 beasts raged and howled on the other side of the basement. The call was from Salvatore Sateri, a man who was almost certainly a mob boss. I declined the call and set the phone to do not disturb as Gerald gnashed his wolf fangs. The next day, we were informed that Salvatore's son had been shot in the stomach and was bleeding out when he'd called us. We could have probably saved him, but we didn't, and he died. A few days later, we got a call from Candice Hart while we were on the golf course. She was an assassin for hire, and we had treated Candice and her friends for various wounds over the years. When she called that day, she sounded hysterical. "Candice," I said, "slow down. You're not making sense." "A fucking werewolf got Melissa," she said, breathlessly. "Ripped her fucking guts out." "A werewolf?" I asked. Gerald looked at me with a frown. "Look, whatever's going on, can you meet us at the spot in 15 minutes? "I'm already there," said Candice. "Fucking hurry." Then she hung up. "Did she say something about a werewolf?" asked Gerald, throwing his 9-iron into the bag and getting in the golf cart. "She did. She said it eviscerated her partner." "Is that even possible during the day?" "It is," said Gerald. "Call her back and tell her to meet us at the other spot." "But that's a half-hour away from where she is now," I said. "If the attack happens near where they are, and it probably did if her partner is still alive after getting gutted, then the wolf is probably close by. By the time we get there, We may have company, so the first priority is to get them further away. That also gives us time to prepare for them. No time will be lost. In the end, I called Candice back and told her the new plan. She wasn't happy about it but agreed. 15 minutes later, Gerald and I were at one of our houses, prepping for surgery. "You have the gun, I assume?" asked Gerald. He had ordered me to always carry the gun with the silver bullets in it, in case he turned unexpectedly. I nodded. "Better give it to me," said Gerald. "I have a bit of experience here, sadly." I pulled the gun out of my travel bag and handed it over. He tucked it into the back of his waistband. After we had the basics set up, we went outside with the stretcher and waited. Soon, we saw Candice's car come tearing down the long dirt driveway surrounded by trees. She pulled onto the lawn, right in front of the door to the house, and jumped out of the car. "Jesus fuck. Help her," she shouted. She looked shaken, more shaken than the time she had driven herself to our house with a bullet wound in her chest. She jerked open the rear door to her car. I looked inside and saw that Candice's account of Melissa's condition had been accurate. Melissa was moaning in shock, manually holding her entrails inside her opened-up abdomen. The three of us lifted her carefully onto the stretcher and carried her inside. "What happened?" asked Gerald. "It was a fucking werewolf," said Candice. "Werewolves aren't real," said Gerald. We set Melissa on the operating table. I strapped her down and then injected her with the anesthetic. "Look," said Candice. "We were hired for a hit. They didn't give us any intel on the targets beyond an address and photos, just said it had to be done today. For big money. So against my better judgment, due to Melissa's urging, I agreed. So we get there and take out 2 of the targets. No problem. But the third target, she turned into a fucking werewolf right in front of us. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And she did this." Candice pointed to Melissa's prone body. "Is she going to make it?" Gerald reached in and began rearranging Melissa's guts. "I don't suppose you know her blood type?" "Of course I do," said Candice. "You think we're amateurs?" "It's AB." I went to the refrigerator, got a packet of AB, and began preparing the transfusion. "She might make it," said Gerald, shining a light inside of Melissa's abdomen. "Or she might not. You don't seriously expect us to believe that you saw an actual werewolf? This looks more like a clean wound from a very sharp blade of some kind. The organs are all intact." I was not experienced as Gerald was, but I could see that what he was saying wasn't true. It did indeed look like a wild animal had attacked Melissa. The cut itself was clean, but the organs had been mauled. "Look," said Candice, "believe me or don't believe me. Just get my baby fixed up, okay?" That's when we heard a banging coming from the back door. "Who the fuck is that?" cried Candice. "I was about to ask you the same thing," said Gerald. "Did somebody follow you here? The police maybe? Were you speeding? Driving erratically?" "Again, I'm not a fucking amateur," said Candice. "Anyway, whoever it is, I'll take care of them." She pulled a gun out of her boot. "I'll do my job." "You two do your jobs, right?" Before Gerald could answer, we heard a wild animal howl coming from just outside. I watched Candice as all of the colors drained from her face and was replaced by a look of pure terror. "It's here," she whispered. Gerald rubbed his temples as the banging resumed, accompanied now by a series of low growls. Then he pulled the gun out from behind his back. We heard the sound of the door splintering apart, and something stepping inside. I panicked and grabbed a scalpel, though I knew it would be useless. Only the silver bullets in Gerald's gun would do any good against a werewolf. I forced myself to breathe. As Candace and Gerald lifted their guns and pointed them at the doorway to the room. "Shooting them doesn't work," whispered Candace. "Not even a headshot. It's a fucking werewolf. I told you it was." I heard the sound of claws scraping against the hardwood floors, getting closer. I thought briefly about injecting myself with morphine, just so that my death would be less painful. No, I tried to convince myself. It's okay. Gerald's one of them. He can handle this. But when I looked at Gerald, he looked far from confident, more composed than Candace, or what I imagined I myself looked like, but not calm. And Gerald was always calm, even the day he had handed me the gun for the first time and told me to shoot the wolf version of him should it escape from the chains. The wolf was just around the corner, and then before I could process what was happening, I saw it, in the doorway. A flurry of hair and claws. Leaping through the air at us, howling. I closed my eyes in preparation for death and heard 2 gunshots ring out. When I didn't die, I opened my eyes. The wolf was on the ground, bleeding out from the center of its head. "My God," I heard Gerald say. "What have I done?" That was. The wolf twitched once and then stopped moving. Once it was dead, it began to transform back into human form. From where I was, I could only see the back of the head, but I saw that it was a woman. Candace was standing closer. "Yep," she said. "That's the bitch we were supposed to kill. We got her kids. But then she turned into a fucking werewolf. But it looks like we finally got her. So do you guys believe me now? And can you fix Melissa?" I took a few steps closer and looked down at the dead body. It was Mary Bishop. Gerald turned in an instant. It wasn't like a full moon when he and Mary had struggled against the transformation, when it was as though they were trying to will each bone, each hair follicle, to stay in place, and failing to do so. Gerald wasn't fighting his wolf nature anymore. He was embracing it. And how? Candace was able to fire off an impotent shot from her gun before Gerald lunged at her and sank his fangs into her shoulder. He lifted her then with his jaws, off her feet, and flung her against a wall with a flick of his neck. She collided with a shelf of medical supplies, which all went clattering to the floor as she cried out in pain and shock. She slumped down, clearly injured and terrified, but still conscious. I eyed the gun with the silver bullets that Gerald had dropped to the floor when he had transformed into a wolf, but I stood frozen, too afraid to make a move, too unsure of what move to make. He had just found out that his children had been murdered, and then he had shot his own wife dead. I could understand the man's rage, but it wasn't a man that I was encountering. The beast that was Gerald let out a low growl and jumped up onto the table where Melissa was still strapped, with an open wound across her abdomen, exposing her guts. Gerald clamped down on a string of intestine in his mouth and yanked violently, tearing it apart. A foul stench spread across the room, as did a spray of blood and half-formed fecal matter. Melissa didn't stir, as she was still under the effects of the anesthetics. No matter what she had done, I was grateful for that. Her screams would have made it harder to think, and it was already hard enough to think. I saw an underarm crutch hanging on the wall and reached for it while Gerald was distracted. I thought that I could use it to slide the gun over to me without getting closer to the dangerously furious wolf. Gerald was ripping into Melissa's neck now, pulling her esophagus out. I kept my eyes on that scene while I grasped the crutch and lifted it off the hook. It was difficult to watch. I'd seen most any medical procedure you can imagine, but those always happened under controlled conditions. Here now was a wolf tearing into a human being, tearing at the flesh, pulling away organs, flinging them away. and then going for more. Behind this scene, I saw Candice grasp onto a shelf and pull herself to her feet. As soon as she did, Gerald whipped his head around and let out a howl. Then he leapt. I reached out with the crutch and tried to drag the gun to me, and Gerald dug all 10 claws on his hands into Candice's neck. I succeeded in pulling the gun a foot or so closer to me as Gerald pulled Candice's head off of her body. He held it up above his own head, howled again, and then dropped it with a sickening splat. Then he turned to face me, growling. I dropped the crutch and he dropped to all fours and began stalking towards me. "Gerald," I said. "It's me, William. It's over. You got your revenge. It was well deserved. Now please come back." Gerald bounded through the air and impacted me, knocking me to the ground with his impossibly heavy weight on top of me. He bit into my shoulder and tore a chunk away. The pain was unbearable, and I screamed out, "Gerald!" He stopped mid-lunge, with his terrifying maw hanging open. He leaned his face into mine, his pink eyes inches away from my own, his hot breath stinking of meat. Then he closed his jaw and began sniffing me with his snout. "Please," I muttered. Then he turned and ran out of the room. I dressed the wound on my shoulder while I tried to think about what to do. The burning pain made it difficult to focus, but I was eventually able to gain my bearings. Salvatore Satori. He must have put a hit on Gerald's family as payback for us not saving his son's life. That was the only thing that made sense. So now Gerald was almost certainly on his way to perpetuate the cycle of revenge. I looked down at Mary's dead body and couldn't blame Gerald, but he had given me clear instructions on what to do if he ever was unleashed to the world in his transformed state. If you can, shoot to wound. If you can't, shoot to kill. I scooped up the gun with the silver bullets and headed out the door. Satori was usually at his restaurant just out of town when he required our services. That's where we went down to the basement. So I figured that was probably the first place where Gerald went, though I'll admit I didn't know how it worked. Can werewolves remember and reason? Either way, that was the only thing I could think of to do. When I got outside, I saw that Gerald's car was still in the driveway, meaning he'd taken off on foot, or paws, or whatever those horrible and sharp appendages were called. He was incredibly fast, had gotten a head start, and could travel places where cars couldn't. But there was still a good chance I could get there before him if I sped. The only question was if I wanted to get there before him. Satori had ordered the death of his wife and children. He deserved to die. For that reason, I decided not to speed to the restaurant. Well, for that reason, plus the fact that it was hard to focus on the road. The pain in my shoulder seemed to be spreading out, setting my body on fire. A werewolf bit me, I thought. That can't be good. After a few minutes of driving, I arrived at Satori's Italian restaurant. There were a few cars in the parking lot, but no signs of activity, until I heard the gunshots and screams coming from inside. I decided to let Gerald finish his business. I got out of my car and sat crouched behind it, the gun clenched in my hand, aiming at the front door. I figured I had one shot and one shot only. I would aim for the thigh if I could. Gerald had given me shooting lessons and I'd gotten fairly proficient, but I knew that it would be hard to hit a target capable of moving so fast with any kind of precision. I crouched there for what seemed like a long, dreadful time, as my fear mounted and the gun became slick with sweat. Then the door to the restaurant flew open, and there was the monstrous wolf, dripping in blood and gore. It dropped down on all fours and started sniffing the ground, giving me the perfect opportunity for a targeted shot. I tried to aim the gun, but I couldn't. My hand was shaking. I grasped it with my other hand as well, though that was weak with the pain spreading out from my shoulder. I clenched my jaw and tried to steady myself as Gerald continued sniffing the ground. Then he looked up, directly at my car. I started to squeeze the trigger, aiming in his general direction. That was the best I could do. Suddenly, I saw a flash of silver, and Gerald's wolf head came flying off its body. I released the trigger and watched in horror and confusion as the head hit the ground with a thud. The body remained standing for several seconds, convulsing before it too dropped to the ground. Then the head and body transformed back into their human forms. I stayed crouched down, trying to figure out what had happened. Two men emerged from behind a jeep. One had a gun pointing at Gerald's corpse. The other walked over and picked something off the ground. "Damn, Jameson, you've got pretty good aim with that thing," said the man with the gun. I looked to see that Jameson was holding some kind of silver brooch. "Yeah, well, if I'm being honest, the thing kind of has a mind of its own. Do you think it will work, Clarence, against the big one this Friday?" "I sure as shit hope it does, kid," said Clarence, rolling Gerald's severed head over with his foot. "Huh, never seen this one before. These fuckers are coming out of nowhere in droves." "That's bad, right?" asked Jameson. "Well, it's good for business," said Clarence, bending down to pick up Gerald's head by the hair. He stuffed it into a duffel bag that he had around his shoulder. "But in general, if you're asking, in general, whether it's a good or bad thing that we've got a shitload of werewolves coming out as we get closer and closer to the full moon, if you're asking, in general, whether it's a good or bad thing that the big one is coming, well, Jamie, I'd have to say that it's a very bad thing, in general. Now help me with the body." I watched in helpless horror and confusion as the two men dragged my friend's body over to the trunk of the Jeep. They hoisted him in. Then they got in the front and pulled out of the parking lot. I have been locked inside my house for the past 2 days now. The pain at first spread throughout my body until I couldn't move or think. Then it was gone, replaced by incredible alertness and feeling of vigor. A thick patch of hair has begun to sprout on my shoulder, at the spot where Gerald bit me. I am, without a doubt, turning into a werewolf. The full moon is in 5 days. There is a werewolf, and he wants to kill me. Alright, I'll leave. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. I saw him. That thing, today, again. Just before dusk as I was walking back to the house. The house I live in now is a dot among thousands of acres of forest. A single winding gated road stretching the several miles between it and the main highway. It's routine for me to walk the long road all the way to the gate and back again. I had timed it so I'd be arriving back home just before dark if I headed out just after lunch. Today my timing was off. The sky was turning orange and pale pinks just beyond the wooded tree line crowding around the road. It wasn't completely dark just yet, but on the road beneath the trees, it might as well have been. I had a mile to go before reaching the house when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. This was a normal occurrence though. After all, I was living in the woods now and it was filled with deer and other smaller animals. Though, I knew better than to think that the darkness moving through the trees, flanking me, was anything so benign as a white tail. I was aware the thing had been stalking me for nearly a week now. It had been drawing closer with each passing day, as if gathering its courage or, possibly, waiting for mine to wane. I felt my legs ache to run, but I resisted. I tried not to turn my head toward the darkness, not to look at its gaunt white face, eerie gaping mouth, but it was moving closer. I couldn't help but see it even when keeping forward focus on reaching the faux safety of paint and plaster walls. Before, I'd had to look through the trees and allow my eyes to adjust to the absence of light in order to see its figure among the pines. Long, lanky, and ever so alien. Its face and long, clawed hands seemed to glow with their paleness, standing stark amongst all the black. That was no longer the case. It stared at me with eyes so pitched they appeared to vacuum away the light that my eyes attempted to reflect so I might see. The thing was hardly bothering to remain within the line of trees. I knew it was nearly done with whatever game it was playing. Its patience was spent or its resolve fully gathered. Maybe it decided I was afraid enough now. I'd refused to stop taking my walks after the first day I had seen it. It had looked at me through the gate across the highway. It looked but did not see. The thing made its move. Stepping away from the tree line bold. It would hide no longer. We stared into the eyes of each other for a moment, peering into the abyss and feeling its hunger. I then closed the door and slammed the bolt home. James and Carrie, Mum and Dad, were already upstairs in their bedroom. They often knocked out early after a liquid dinner of scotch and other poisons. I hadn't lived here that long, but I knew the game. It was the same everywhere I went. They didn't care about me, I just came with the checks. If it wasn't for my mild tech addiction, I probably wouldn't bother coming inside. Out in the wild is my true home, anyway. Nature, the only parent that actually cared. Of course, that was before this thing decided it could take over and send me running to the shelter of the modern world. I watched through the glass of the front door, my hand still hard on the lock. It stood there in the open, watching me through the door, unafraid. It slowly strode forth on long, thin legs, back curving forward, causing its gaping eyes and mouth to thrust outward. I could now see the broken and filthy dagger-like teeth crowding its mouth like a splintered wooden fence with 3 times too many pikes. With its long, spindly, talon-tipped hands scraping the ground, it galloped toward the electrical pole out front of the house. It stared at the grey metal box for a moment before drawing its vicious hand to smash the box to the ground, ripping it from the pole in a shower of sparks and splintered wood. My house was instantly plunged into darkness. Not pausing to see what the creature was doing next, I raced through the house, locking every door and window. By the time I had reached the back door last, a sliding glass door, it was standing there, face pressed against the clear surface. Its eyes stared at me, unblinking. I froze. Our faces were just inches away from each other, with only the feeble security of the glass between us that the door provided. I felt the goosebumps prickle over my body, causing my hair to stand on end. The thing began to slowly shake as its sagging mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It was silently laughing at me. Slowly exhaling, I reached out and locked the door. It kept its smile. Its head slowly turned to the side, raising one hand bearing the incredibly long, claw-tipped fingers, and slowly dragged them along the length of the glass. I slowly began to back away as screams from each sharp talon filled the night, the glass seeming to plead for mercy. I turned and ran. It wouldn't take much time for it to break into the house. Despite the back door being glass, it was actually quite strong. He would have a better chance of breaking in the front door than the double-tempered glass. I had a small amount of time to do what was necessary in order to be ready when it came to eating. My preparations being complete, I sat as far from the single door that led into the basement as I could place myself. I'd barricaded the door with the weights that James kept down here from his glory days as the high school's star quarterback. If there was any doubt that he had peaked in his late teens, it was extinguished now, him already being dead and all. Turns out I was right. About 3 tries were all the creature had needed to take down the front door. James and Carrie had never even awoken from their drunken stupors. Their bodies now lay mangled in the corner of the upstairs bedroom, used and discarded for what little they had been worth, likely more useful as corpses than they had been as people. I deduced that its strength, while considerable, wasn't so great. Stronger than a human, but it's bigger, so one would expect as much. It's been searching the house for 10 minutes now, going to and fro from the rooms of the house, raking the walls with its claws, expecting my fear to get the best of me and make an attempt to escape. It will be disappointed. Seems it couldn't sniff me out, but the house isn't so big and time is almost up. Closer now. It's coming for me. I twisted my clammy hands into my shirt as I kneel, knees landing with a soft thud against the concrete floor. I hung my head, feeling my dark hair fall around my ears. I could hear the tips of my hair scraping against my cheeks. It was terribly loud, similar to the sound of sandpaper sliding across the floor. My insides churn as I close my eyes and wait in the darkness of my basement. My heartbeat begins to speed up and sweat forms on my face. My blood pressure was through the roof. I knew my skin was betrayed by this point. It's pushing in the door now. The weights are scraping across the floor. A pointless resistance. I see its white face squeezing through the small space it's made as the creature wiggles and squeezes into the basement. Those dark eyes have found me once more at last. The spidery fingers curl and spread while its body rises and falls with silent breaths. My breathing is becoming uneven, unable to take in enough oxygen. The thing is standing before me, looking at me, as it always has. No, it's different this time around. Now it sees for the first time, it truly sees me with those dead, unblinking eyes. I knew it had some intelligence. After all, it had stalked me. It had destroyed the power box. It's not just some dumb animal. Now that I've heard it struggle to enter my home, see it squeeze through the small space I allotted for it to gain access into the basement, verified that it is, indeed, flesh. Corporeal, just like any other thing. There are no such things as ghosts, that I still believe, but monsters? They exist. I never doubted that, but I'd never encountered a thing like this before. It considered me for the first real time. I smiled, revealing my sharp teeth, blood still staining them from my previous kill. "Sorry about my parents," I said in the most neutral tone I could manage, with my heart racing the way it was. "I couldn't let you have them." I unwound my crimson-coated hands from my shirt, each of my fingers now crowned with thick, curved, black claws. I needed them to sate my hunger, to be sure I could fuel my change. My veins bulged and muscles swelled. My bones bending, breaking, and reconnecting at new points. I felt that familiar pain comforting me as my face stretched into a muzzle. I fell forward, changing by the time my hands reached the concrete. My morphed form was meant to be on all fours. I'd say its surprise was apparent, but it really wasn't. The creature's eyes remained wide and black, mouth gaping, as always. It wasn't smiling now then again. Neither was I. This thing had treated me like prey in my own forest and dared to think it could hunt where I hunted in a failed attempt to drive me from my new home. My territory. A vicious growl rolled and rumbled deep within my chest as a warning. My lips curled back to expose the abnormally long, arched, white fangs. I snapped once at the space between us. A promise of what was to come. Dawn was blooming as I lit the few decorative candles Carrie kept on the small coffee table in the living room. I absently swept them into the curtains, which roared into life like dry kindling. I stepped out through my front door, now hanging askew on busted hinges. My ripped jeans, that I'd retrieved from a puddle of the creature's blood, were now stained black. They were clinging and tugging at me as I slowly trudged towards the tree line. Euphoria arose within me, for my latest meal fueled me as nothing had before. The black blood stained my skin, I could still feel it coating my mouth like oil. The black blood was new to me. No one seemed to be able to see the thing, at least not as it truly was. I remembered a week ago when I first saw it through the gate across the highway, loitering in a residential area. There were plenty of people around, but they didn't seem to notice it, their eyes simply sweeping over the creature as if it were any normal nondescript person. It must have had some way of hiding its real self, perhaps not being normal. Myself is what allowed me to see its true face. That is, after all, why it hunted me. I could see it. Unfortunately, for the creature, it seems that it couldn't really see me. They hide in plain sight, hunting their human prey. They trespass in my woods to stalk those they think are weak or those unlucky enough to glimpse their true faces. As for me, I won't be returning to the orphanage. I can pass for 18, anyway. Now I've seen one. Where there is one, there are many. I know they are out there hunting the prey that I once thought was mine. They live among the humans, lions in the lamb, taking what is rightfully mine. Licking at the drying darkness on my lips, hunger renewed and stronger than ever, I stepped into the forest. My forest. The night belongs to me. I will not allow them to take anything from me. I will stalk them as they stalk humans. If they want my prey, then they will compensate for it with their own pale flesh and black blood. To my newfound prey, sweeter for your strength, I will find you in the darkness, beneath the waning light of the moon. Our encounter shall not be pleasant. I am hungry. Hello, my friends. Hey skeleton, where are you? Alright, be cool, be cool. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. If anyone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be hunting down and decapitating werewolves, I would have asked them what they had been smoking. You see, I often find myself awestruck by how much has changed in such a short time. On that fateful day 2 years ago, my life was irreversibly intertwined with the fate of the backwoods of southwest Georgia. My husband and I had moved from the center of a major city to the outskirts of the county in order to get out of the stab zone, as we called it. We lived in an apartment that was known as a hotspot for illegal activity and murder. On top of all of this, the maintenance men were sketchy. One I knew for certain was a registered sex offender, and the other one never knocked before letting himself into our apartment. His antics prompted me to adopt a large dog from the local pound. My apologies, I'm rambling. Let's see, where was I? Oh yeah. We'd just moved to the edge of the county. We now lived so far out into the boondocks that the only option for the internet was a satellite service. For two people who spent more time than the average person on the internet, it was quite the adjustment, especially given that we had a bandwidth limit that if we reached it, our speed would be drastically throttled to a crawl. The funny thing about not having easily accessed internet is that you start to notice things in your environment that you'd otherwise be distracted from. One such detail we started to pick up on was the fact that no one stayed in the area for long. Within months of us living there, we saw for sale signs popping up in dozens of yards. Weird, but people move all the time. Hell, We just moved. We would joke that they were the weak ones that had to escape to faster internet. Little did we know just how far off we were about the area. It seemed to be around the 6th month of living in the new home that we started to hear the howling at night. My dog would go crazy and hide under the covers on the bed. For reference, he's a 100 pounds plus pit bull mix. Every night when it started. When we'd first moved in, we had noticed that every outside security light had been shot with a BB gun or broken as if ripped from the siding. It was only after the first couple of nights when the howling started to be accompanied by what sounded like several large animals circling our house that we regretted not replacing them immediately. Now I've lived in the country my entire life practically, so the howling wasn't a concern to me, but I did worry for my dog's safety when on walks and going out to relieve himself. I started to bring my shotgun with me at night when I took him out for his nightly walk. It was only the 3rd day of doing this when I ran into trouble. We were about 30 yards away from the house when howling erupted from the trees all around us, giving the effect of it coming from multiple sources and one simultaneously. I don't scare easily, but I won't lie. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up on end. Even though I had my 16 gauges with me, I didn't like the odds of me versus whatever was doing the howling. It sounded a lot bigger than a coyote. Whilst I was spooked, I knew better than to turn my back and just run with my dog and hope for the best. Instead, I began the tense backtrack to my house. I tried to keep my back to the house and whatever it was in front of me based on the sounds it was making. It's safe to say that by the time my dog and I made it to the house, he had tugged so hard on his leash that he was coughing. He was desperate to get inside as soon as possible, and I was on board with that sentiment. I didn't delay, but as I closed the door I took one last glimpse towards the tree line. There in the moonlight stood something my brain struggled to explain. The concept of a dog man or werewolf. It was foreign and had threatened to break my grasp on reality in those brief seconds before I slammed the door shut and locked it. Needless to say, my husband was looking at me as if I were crazy, and when I started to explain to him what I had seen, I started to think he was right. His consoling consisted of suggesting that maybe it was a bear. A deputy that lived down the road from us had said that he'd seen bears in the woods, all the way to thinking maybe our neighbors had wanted to play a prank on us. To catch you all up on what sort of neighbors we had, the ones on the right side abused their dogs and children. I had called the cops on them once for hitting their son in the front yard so hard that his nose was bleeding. Ever since I'd called the cops on them anytime we were outside doing yard work or what have you, the mother would come out and scream obscenities and threats at us. She never acted on those words. Thankfully, the neighbors on the left side kept to themselves mostly. My only interaction with them has been when I was picking blackberries with my dog at my side. The sun had recently gone down and I was using a flashlight to navigate the thorny bushes. During my absent-minded harvesting, one of the neighbors from the left had wandered up to the property line. I knew they'd been drinking all day and into the evening since they'd been loud and obnoxious. This guy took his flashlight and shined it through the small line of trees and said, "I see you. What the fuck are you doing?" As if I was on his property or something, when in all reality he was making his way onto our property with a flashlight in my face. I shouted at him to get the fuck off my property. I'm lucky that my harsh words stunned him and he simply stumbled back, drunkenly reporting to his relatives what happened. No doubt embellishing to make himself look good. I know you're probably wondering why all of the backstory, and that none of this seems to have anything to do with decapitating werewolves. To that sentiment, I say every good story needs a strong beginning and foundation. I need you, dear readers, to understand the climate of the street I lived on in order for you to later understand the desperation that would bring us all together to fight off certain death that the Glen Werewolf problem posed upon our existence. Now I know the beginning of this story hasn't been all that interesting so far, but when I return I will dive into when the action and terror truly began,